Hello and welcome to the Sonic Fruit Film Podcast, where we aim to celebrate movies through the simple act of talking about our favourites. I'm Bennet Maples, and today I'm joined by the celebrated Carl Cole, composer and Sonic Fruit's resident Foley artist, and the sublime Sam Hoad, media academic and Picture House employee. In this episode, we're discussing Alien, which was not the post-Brexit social drama which we'd expected, but is, it turns out, a cracking movie. So, gentlemen.
Hello.
It's 1979. And I think I'm right in saying unknown Sigourney Weaver at this stage, actress in an ensemble cast. Rewatching it, that was something I found really interesting to think, actually, you look at that cast and you don't know that she's going to become this amazing heroine.
Well, it's such a pivotal role, isn't it? As such a key female character.
In the industry.
Well, that's the thing. So I'm thinking, I didn't know the film when it came out. I'm of a generation who's too young, I'm happy to say. So I knew it posthumously, and I kind of already knew, therefore, that she was, this kick-ass figure. But actually, you go back and go, you've got an ensemble cast, and she's just one of them. You don't know who's going to live and who's going to die.
Yeah, I think because I would have seen the film alongside Aliens, where she really does blossom into this amazingly strong character. Because in Alien, it takes a while. She is this... she's a strong female, but it takes a while for her to really become that role in the film. And then, of course, when Aliens kicks off, and we're not talking about that, but she really runs with that. So I think it really was the follow-up that helped cement that. And we won't talk about the others. They didn't happen.
No, we love them. And also, interestingly, because she does the right thing. She tries to stop them from bringing the alien onto the ship, but you're not necessarily behind her doing that.
No.
And I think if that's the first time you're watching the film and you haven't seen the sequels, which presumably nobody had in 1979, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, she's the hero, she's going to save them because she's trying not to bring the thing onto the ship.
Well, I watched a really interesting interview with Jerry Goldsmith where he described all of the characters as very unlikable, which I thought was quite interesting because I guess... I like the two guys. Parker is one of them, but the two guys they're almost the comic relief in the film.
They're slightly Shakespearean, I think. You always have those two little clowns that kind of come on periodically.
Yeah, they're moaning about what they're getting paid and how them having to stop on this other planet is taking time that they're not being contracted to do, and all that stuff. So, quite fitting.
I really like Ash, the captain. He's very cool.
Yeah.
Ian Holm, you're never sure, are you? Even before the reveal, you don't know quite his motivations. But I like the dynamic, I suppose. That's one of the great things about Alien, isn't it? It's the ensemble. Well, Weaver does then become, the key figure. All the naturalistic dialogue when they're all, coming round from hypersleep and they are bitching about the company and their wages and their bonuses and stuff. I suppose, again, not knowing the context into which it arrives, but I think that hadn't been done before. Sci-fi was always kind of the Star Trek spectrum end of things. It was clean.
Blake 7.
And
very
things
kind of
worked and it was all very shiny and...
Yeah.
He said he wanted this to be truckers in space or something. Is that?
Yeah, that's right.
And space truckers. And
they're all very anti-hero, aren't they? None of them really want to go down to the planet. None of them are very happy about the fact that they're there. They were out there to do a job and now they want to go home.
They're all very human, though, as a result, right?
Yeah.
They're not like non-emotion, kind of future people. They're distinctly of now kind of thing and people today. So... I find I sympathise with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the sense of relief, the dinner scene for me is the key one there because actually that's where they all seem really human. The sense of relief in the characters about the fact that they had this close call with this alien being, but it seems okay, and so they're sitting down and they're eating a meal together before they then go into hypersleep, and of course it doesn't end too well. So
it doesn't quite pan out. As
no,
we would have hoped. That scene still shocks. I mean, we've talked on another podcast about Jaws and things, and I can watch Jaws, and apart from the Quint death at the end, it doesn't really scare me as I've got older, but Alien still has the power to really upset and disturb me.
It's the look of shock on their faces.
Well, that was
when the initial spurt of blood comes from his chest.
Some of that's real, isn't it?
Yeah, he hadn't told them.
I know,
he?
and that's the thing. It was such an amazing the image. I can always remember the image as you get the shot of the rest of the crew as all their faces are splattered with a little bit of blood from his chest, and it's brilliant. It's just amazing. So.
And what about the style of it? Because you mentioned before, but there presumably hadn't been anything that was as gritty as that. The look of not just the ship, but the alien, and I mean even the style of the costumes and the nature of the crew.
When I think of it, I always think it's an oppressive, stuffy, hot. It's a sweaty movie. There's that great scene in like an episode of Cheers when they're all sitting around and they're talking about the sweatiest movies of all time. And I would always put Alien up there because it drips. You just get that sense of, and it's claustrophobic. And
there's the great scene where one of the characters is looking up. There's that big hall that he's in, and it's raining within this.
The moisture's coming.
Yeah,
and you feel that sense of like
the chains are rattling, and but it does really give that sense of it being humid and close and claustrophobic.
Yeah. Which again you wouldn't expect in a sci-fi generally, but generally obviously because you're looking at computers and things all the time, kind of assume that wouldn't go together.
It's the use of colour as well, though, isn't it? Because a lot of sci-fi was very white and very clean. Everything was, certainly you look at Star Wars or any of those films, everything's quite pristine.
2001 had set quite a clean benchmark as well, didn't it?
Completely.
It was quite sterile and NASA-esque, one imagines.
But Alien isn't like that at all. It's grimy, and I think that's what really sets it apart.
Gnarly, as I think kids say these days.
No, 20 years ago they were saying
sorry. Pop culture references out of date again.
So let me talk about the soundscape a little bit. You referenced Goldsmith.
Yeah.
What did you make of the music as a music man?
Well, I mean, there's just an interesting story behind the music in this film anyway, because they had... I always loved the score to this film. It's beautifully haunting. And it wasn't until much later that I realised that Goldsmith was really unhappy with Ridley Scott because they'd cut out a lot of his original cues. And, Goldsmith was openly very vocal about this, and I think you can even see it on the special features on the DVD. And because they'd essentially cut apart his original intentions, they bought music from an older film of his called Freud and dropped those cues in where they felt they fitted better because they were part of the temp track, and that's an issue between directors and composers that comes up a lot. And they'd even replaced his end credits music with another piece. I'm trying to think of what that piece was, but it's completely unrelated to Goldsmith's original intentions. The criticism that the studio made was that his score was too lush and romantic, and they wanted something more avant-garde and haunting and sparse. And having listened to both, I can see where Ridley Scott was coming from. I think Goldsmith maybe just didn't get the intentions from the director. Both scores are wonderful. I think as pieces of music, they are tremendous. However, I think what Ridley Scott went with does fit the film better, which is difficult because Goldsmith's a god when it comes to composing music for film. So
don't want to talk against him.
No, completely not. But I think you'd have to concede that he got this one wrong, and actually the filmmaker's original intentions were ultimately played out in the final cut.
Yeah.
So
see, I find that really interesting because within the soundscape of the film, there isn't. I mean, we're pre 5.1 with this, so that actually, by today's standards, there isn't a lot of sound. There's some great sound, but actually the music serves an awful lot of the purpose in terms of giving the ship character and setting the mood, where much more these days I think you would, you might pan down a corridor quietly because the sounds of the ship are going to speak for themselves. In those days you couldn't really do that as effectively. And the music does a lot of that opening sequence particularly.
Yeah. You
really get exactly where you are, and I mean even before you see the people, you know who they are. And
the interesting thing is that with Goldsmith's originally intended score, that it stands the test of time better. It's more of a classic score. It's rich orchestration, very orchestral. But with what they ultimately went with was more sound effects, as is kind of common with 70s film scores. The introduction of echo units and things like that started jumping into film scores and being part of the soundscape. And there's a lot more of that in Ridley Scott's version of the film. So, and I find that really interesting because it dates the film musically. Because nowadays we still use all those effects in film scoring, but they're much more subtle. Whereas, I mean, just the opening main title in the reworked version, the version that ended up being released, features quite heavy delay on woodwinds, which nowadays just sounds horribly dated. It sounds, quite tacky.
Just because we could.
Yeah, because we could, and because it was a new and a very fresh sound at the time.
Yeah.
But nowadays, you'd never hear a film score with that on it. Certainly not of that kind of stature.
The object, given when it came out, was to not be Star Wars.
Exactly.
I think it was presumably trying to be very anti.
And I think the Goldsmith's original score had lots of horns, lots of. Like I was saying earlier on that there was the main theme has a trumpet kind of introducing one of the main motifs of the film, and they dropped that in favour of something that was much more sparse, much more haunting, and very definitely not John Williams doing Star Wars. So, interesting. I think because both directions for the film work in a cinematic way, it's hard to not be in love with the original, though. So,
because Horner did Aliens, right?
Yeah.
Was it Goldsmith or Horner who was responsible for that, like 4-note mode, da 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 da, that plays? Is that him? And was that on his original score?
In Alien?
In Alien.
That would have been Goldsmith, or it would have been a repurposed cue. As to which parts, I haven't been through with a fine-tooth comb and found out which part. I would imagine it was probably part of... Because what they did as well is they took Goldsmith's cues out of context. And this is very upsetting to a composer, is when the filmmakers will take a cue out of context and then put it somewhere else in the film. Yeah. Of course, to the composer's eye, it's completely wrong.
That's saying we know the film better than you do.
Yeah.
You didn't understand what you were doing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I can understand why he was upset, but I can understand why Ridley Scott would have made that choice. And ultimately, the studio, because they would have had if the studio says, we don't like the music, the director has to answer to them anyway. So
it's an interesting, saying everything that we're saying, it is an interesting studio film from that point of view, because I suppose Star Wars had maybe changed the mould, and maybe they felt that changing the mould was a thing that one should try to do. But yeah, looking back on it, there'd never been anything like that before, as we said.
They're both Fox, right? They're both 20th Century Fox, yeah. And their producers feature quite heavily on the bonus material on the box set, don't they? And,
yeah.
Do you know how they came to hire Ridley? Because obviously he'd done one film before.
Duelists, yeah.
And then this was his second film, right?
Okay.
And he came from advertising, obviously, but there is so much material on those bonus discs that I've never made my way through all of it. And I don't know how much of it was his baby, or whether he was, did he instigate it, or did they bring him on as a director for hire kind of thing? Because he kind of stamps himself in the way that it made made Sigourney Weaver. It set out a lot of Scott's kind of hallmarks from the off, didn't it? It's very assured, isn't it? It's incredibly well done.
Yeah, very ambitious as a film, and how they, I always wonder how they managed to sell these ideas to a studio.
Well, I think one of the things that we find in this context, when we're discussing films in this context and we're picking films that are this good, is it's so difficult sometimes, because the answer is they did it right. It's clearly a good script. The casting is incredible. I mean, they're mainly pretty unknown actors at this point, and now they're all pretty much all names. And yeah, it's Ridley Scott, as you say, hadn't really done anything at that point. I mean, The Duelist isn't a film that you'd watch and go, that guy should do a sci-fi film. That's what he's missing in his roster. So yeah, he's not necessarily an obvious choice. But yeah, everything's right. The style of it. It's interesting what you're saying about the music. I find interesting, because rewatching it, I was surprised by how dated I thought it was. I really like this film. But I was watching it and thinking, actually, yeah, it has aged much more than I was thinking. And I couldn't really see why. The costumes, maybe a little bit, but the look of it and the movements of the camera and things like that don't seem to date it at all.
It's computer screens.
Yeah, a little bit of that. Yeah, I mean, anything with lights in is clearly We had lots of little bulbs.
And in fairness,
which
it's
now
the
is-
sounds as well, because all the computers make that
They
ticking
make
noise.
that dot matrix printer
Yeah.
noise as well, don't
exactly.
they?
Which nowadays, it's like it would be like using the tones of dial-up in something that's meant to be current and
Sure.
electronic data transfer. It was all over the place in sound when in the 90s, but now it's not relevant at all. And so I think it's that kind of thing that back in the late 70s, early 80s, that would have been the sound people would expect from computers if they were to make an audible sound.
Sure. And when you see those computers, that is the sound you expect them to
Exactly.
make.
Yeah,
I mean,
because the screens are very dated and the
LCD
buttons are all
screens and
very blocky and things like that. So it's not exactly Minority Report in terms of pushing the boundaries on technology. But I get the feeling the budget.
But it's not all. I mean, if you look, the corridors and things like that, because they're all, as we say, it's very much space truckers. There's lots of pipe work and things like that. So it's not a high-tech
Yeah.
ship.
Steam, a lot of
So,
steam in
yeah.
Alien.
Yeah.
So there isn't masses that really gives it away. As you say, lights, the core
Oh, the computer room.
computer room,
Yeah.
which is obviously supposed to be the central kind of hub.
Mother.
Yeah, which is just lights on the wall, and that really looks horrific now.
Yeah. But I do get the feeling, the studio were taking a punt on something that they didn't know whether it would work or not. So spending a small
Again, we're
fortune
in an era
special
where an
effects.
awful lot of this stuff hasn't been done. A lot of it is experimenting, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of it hasn't, won't be done conclusively until the 80s.
But it's worth noting that when it works in that film, it is amazing.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking actually, I remember thinking there's a lot of scenes that I thought would look more dated. I've always thought the laser across the top of the eggs is a bit weird. It's a bit like a Jean-Michel Jarre concert.
Yeah.
But the eggs themselves, everything else about that scene is great.
You can't not mention H.R. Geiger's influence to the visual look of that film, really, because it's stunning. He makes the alien. He makes the eggs, the way they look, and everything is so kind of visceral. And
there's a sense of culture, isn't there? You really get a sense that you have just walked into a believable world where other beings have been existing in their own way.
Yeah.
There's a sort of depth to everything that just gives it tangibility, I think.
Yeah.
So what about genre? Where do we put this as a... Because I have to say, my wife won't watch it because it's scary. That's how she, as far as she's concerned, it's a scary film. She actually won't watch any of the Aliens because this first one is a horror film to her.
It's the pacing, isn't it? It makes it feel like a horror film. I don't really think of it as a horror film, I guess. I think of it as more as a thriller.
I don't, because I'm scared of everything. And I think probably I wouldn't watch this now because I probably would be too scared of how scary it might be.
Yeah.
But it's a very tense film, isn't it? I mean, it is suspense done really well.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's quite a benchmark if you want to direct a film with tension in terms of, is something going to happen? Is something going to happen? Just often enough, it does. Just often enough.
The pace is
actually
slow.
doesn't. And then there's the jump with the cat. And the two jumps with the cat, I seem to recall coming out of that film pretty much hating cats.
Mm-hmm.
But because the pace is so slow, it really builds and it builds and it builds so that when you do get to the end,
And
you're almost thankful that it's all,
It's really breathless. I can't remember how long, but she hits the self-destruct and you've got that horrible countdown siren going on, and it's...
Well, you say you don't know how long. Actually, surprisingly short is the answer. Yeah, it actually isn't. I remember it being like a really long... It's longer in Aliens, that sense of getting out of there and getting out of there and getting out of there. The countdown itself is quite short.
I think of it as a horror, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the other main contender would be sci-fi for me, but I think it's horror. But in a way that Aliens isn't.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Completely. I mean, I think of Aliens as more of an action film.
Yeah, Aliens is
and it's quite a horror film in the sense of we've got an ensemble cast and they get picked off one by one. I mean, it's, I can see John Carpenter watching this and going, yeah, I can see what I could do with that. So it's almost a slasher
it's a
film
monster
in that
movie,
sense.
isn't it?
Yeah, the
it's
monster's picking off and you don't know who's going to go because, as we said before, it's incredible.
But some of the deaths, thinking back to it now, it's coming back, the bit where the Captain Ash goes down into the air ducts or whatever, and you can't see him, you can hear him for a lot of it, and he's in and all you see is he sort of swings around, shines the light, and it's there, and it kind of does that thing with its arms, and then it cuts, and and they know, that it's all masterful. The bits that he gets right,
and it's the constant, it's the use of repetition in the sound that I find adds to that claustrophobic feel of the film as well. The sound of the motion trackers and the siren we were talking about, the self-destruct siren and things like that. And the steam coming out of the walls and all that kind of. It's almost like it's grinding away at your defences to be able to not feel really tense. It builds that suspense really well.
It totally puts you on that ship, doesn't it? It's a fully realised environment, and
And does it help? We did say before that they were pretty much all unknown actors. I'm now trying to think whether actually that's true, because
I think
Tom Skerritt, was he unknown at that point?
I don't know. Actually,
I'm trying to think what I actually know him for now. I'm a big fan of Contact, so I guess I think of that. But
Ian Holm, I think, didn't go on to have a huge film career, but he did a lot of work in theatre. He was very respected, I think, even at that stage.
Yeah, well, same with John Hurt. He would have done a lot of theatre by that point, but presumably not a huge amount of film.
I mean, Harry Dean Stanton was a name, certainly in 70s cinema.
When did Paris, Texas come out?
I think that was early in the decade. Yaphet Kotto, the black guy.
He'd been a Bond villain.
So
you just picked that name out of your head.
I love that name, Yaphet Kotto.
Because I've got the cast, I can say it's Veronica Cartwright. I probably couldn't have remembered her name.
No.
But you recognise her face. You remember her face.
Yeah,
sure.
She's one of those amazing actors who does have exactly the right face to play all kinds of different characters and then manage to just make you forget that she's been in other things. Witches of Eastwick is the film I always think of her in. She's like the very pious sort of parson's wife, and vomits all the cherry stones very memorably.
Oh, is that her?
Yeah.
Right.
A beautiful scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, they pick them off one by one, don't they? And isn't it? Aren't there comparisons drawn with one of the Agatha Christie famous,
was it 12 Little Indians?
10 Little Indians. Yeah, it's that kind of setup, isn't it? Which again asks another question of what genre it falls into, because it is like a haunted house sort of, or
Yeah, well, it doesn't, from that point of view, it doesn't have the whodunit element.
No,
we're pretty clear.
Yeah. It's not a massive question of.
But what's interesting is that.
Clues in the title.
Obviously, they introduce the face hugger as a thing, and there's a release from the tension when it falls off of John Hurt's face, and they're obviously enjoying their meal, and then it becomes this small alien, which you think, okay, that's a relatively minor threat, and then all of a sudden, over the course of a few hours, what seemingly seems like a few hours,
those things grow up fast.
Yeah, it's this 8-foot tall monstrosity.
Mm-hmm. You think it's impressive that giraffes can walk when they hit the ground?
Yeah.
But these bad boys.
Completely. I mean, see how quickly the
and
little one runs.
Yeah, that little critter can move, can't it?
That seems like a good note to wrap it up on. And that little critter can move. That's the conclusion of this. Except to thank Sam and Carl for joining me, and to thank you for listening. And don't forget, if you want to contact us, you can email podcast@sonicfruit.co.uk, or you can tweet us via @sonic_fruit. The Sonic Fruit Film Podcast is produced by Sonic Fruit, with music by Carl Cole and engineering by Jake Kenny and Jordan Brett. For more information, check out sonicfruit.co.uk.